Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. It is my great pleasure and privilege today to have with me as my guest on the podcast, Kelly Carlin. Kelly Carlin is an author, solo show artist, documentary producer, podcaster, entrepreneur, and founder of Humans on the Verge, a personal transformation program that invites people to courageously step into a more authentic next chapter. Kelly's fascination with all things media led her to an undergraduate degree in communications from UCLA, and her love of mythology and depth psychology led her to Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she earned her master's in 2004. Through her comedic and soulful storytelling in both her solo show and best-selling memoir, A Carlin Home Companion, Growing Up with George, Kelly revealed to audiences and readers how being the, quote, daughter of, unquote, shaped her heart, mind, and creativity. She executive produced the two-part HBO documentary, George Carlin's American Dream, directed by Judd Apatow and Michael Bonfiglio, which won the 2022 Emmy for Outstanding Documentary or Nonfiction Special. She is currently developing a new book and podcast and expanding her reach with her online forum, The Sacred and the Profane. Kelly Carlin, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
I can't wait to be the person I want to be. I'm so excited to be here.
Finally, today is the day.
Oh, thank God it's come.
So I just want to say for listeners that I first had the experience of watching Kelly's solo show over a decade ago, and it really left quite an impression on me. And then more recently, I read the memoir by the same name, A Carlin Home Companion. And of course, granted, there was a decade plus in between those two, but it seemed like the book went into much greater detail, even though it had the same spirit and the same arc as the solo show. And I have to tell you, Kelly, honestly, Scout's honor here, not that I was a Scout, Human's honor, that the book, I laughed, I cried, I was very, very moved by it. I really enjoyed it and got quite a lot out of it, and I highly recommend it to anyone viewing or listening today. We'll get into that, certainly.
Thank you, Eric. I
Yeah.
really appreciate that. You know, we don't create in the void here, and even though we create to fulfill something deep within us, of course, there's an impact you want to have, and you do want people to feel like that they can come along for the ride. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind after absorbing that book was generous. It's a very generous memoir in that you share so willingly, so candidly, and so honestly throughout your entire lifespan, really. And you're not the least bit afraid of, self-deprecating. In fact, it seems like you tried to call as many self-deprecating stories as you could. And what it does is it really earns a lot of, I think, trust from the reader that, oh, this is a real person who had, it goes through real struggles and has had some real challenges and difficulties. And even though the specifics of your circumstances might seem unusual to a lot of people, I think there's so much to relate to in your story, just as the evolution of a human. So
Yeah, I think, part of my motivation back when I first had a motivation to tell my story in public, which was in 99, I knew I had a human story to tell. I just, I may have come from an extraordinary family and had an extraordinary kind of interesting life, but we were just a very ordinary American family in a lot of ways too, especially those families that had kids in the 60s, us early Gen Xers, I call us. I don't feel like a baby boomer at all. I was born in 63. There's a very specific vibe that went on in those families. And I knew that I hadn't seen a ton out there, a little bit out there of that experience, but I knew it would talk to people in that way. So that was a huge, huge part of why I wanted to tell our story. And I just knew it was going to have that impact. And when you know something in your bones and you got to go for it, um, that I think is, I think that's like the biggest thing I love talking about and trying to teach other people to do, is to really, really trust their own bones and their own gut when it comes to, kind of who they want to be and how they want to walk in the world.
Yeah, there's so much in your story that's relevant to the theme of this podcast, which is really about stepping into who you are and becoming your authentic self, and even, discovering and or creating that person as you move through life. And your story really, to me, is one ultimately about individuation. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm gonna quote just a couple of times from your book to launch some questions. And very early on in the book, you say, "I've always felt as if my family's journey has unfolded like some kind of mythological legend. Our lives together have felt shaped by a force, threads of fate, or maybe even what my dad called the big electron. Something was calling us forth and interweaving exactly the right people, places, and things to form one amazing life together. It's always seemed so destined." To me, like, this begs this unanswerable question that I love talking about, which is just the nature nurture question. And how do you feel about nature versus nurture? What are your thoughts as to, are they equally strong influences? Is one more important than the other in determining our who we become? What do you think?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think they are kind of piles we've created as humans to figure this stuff out and to understand all this. I think as humans, we are endlessly curious about, how did I get here and how does it happen? I mean, I have been my whole life, but you look at, I mean, that's what psychology is, or evolutionary biology, all that kind of stuff. Always fascinated by that. And I don't know. I think it's definitely both. I think there's a part of us where, as my dad used to say, you don't lick it off the rock, which is an old Irish saying for, it kind of comes inside your bones. And then, of course, our environments and the culture we grew up in is the things that define us, and how we make those very important choices around 4, 5, and 6 about how the universe works and how we're going to survive in it and succeed in it. Uh, and then there's this other thing, which is beyond nurture and nature, that James Hillman talks about, which is the daemon, or the genius, or the acorn theory, as he calls it. This other part of psyche that is beyond us as physical beings, or beyond the family we're kind of dropped into, that has it has a desire of its own. Some people call it soul. It's why I studied, I mean, I didn't know it was why I studied Jungian psychology to begin with, but it's really, this is again, it was one of those moments of like, oh, here's the thing that explains everything. And it took me to going to Pacifica to understand that. Uh, so, it's all part of this fun thing that we call the mystery, right? We'll never know for sure. But it is fun to kind of categorize these things and play with them. And a lot of the work I do with clients, and I think also, like you said, the writing of the book is such a book of individuation. It is that thing about at least understanding the nurture part and understanding how it impacted us, and then being in choice about that, those narratives, those rules we unconsciously take in. Um, and then there is this nature part, is it because I'm Irish and Scotch English and, gift of the gab, or, who, right? And then there's this other part where, if you kind of see it all as a big myth and you're living into it, it's kind of fun too. There's a kind of I mean, why not, right? if we're gonna if we're gonna choose what it all means, why not?
Yeah.
Who's stopping us? As long as we're not Hitler, living that myth, like hurt anybody with your myth, but I think it's just, and there's if you can kind of just lightly hold on to all of it and not make it the answer, I think that's super, super important, even though I spent a lot of my life searching desperately for the answer to it all. But turning 60 this year, I'm like, yeah, whatever it is.
Yeah, I read The Soul's Code years ago, and I remember, but it left an impression. And he talks about that acorn theory, and he likens us to, the oak tree is there within the acorn, waiting to emerge. And with under the right conditions and a nurturing environment, it may grow to be a mighty oak. But the environment definitely is a factor. But I like that idea of the soul's code, that like we have this agenda when we come into the world, that we want to somehow manifest our true nature and who it is that we are. And we have all of these things. Some of these things help us, and some of them are obstacles towards us becoming. And like you, I have always been fascinated by this kind of stuff. I love unanswerable questions. I love to just wonder about them and try to make sense of them, even if I can't. One question I usually like to start these interviews with when I have guests on is to ask this. Kelly, what is your earliest recollection? And you have an incredible memory, as evidenced by your memoir. I want to ask you about the writing process of that as well. But what is your earliest memory specifically about, who it is you felt you were or wanted to be, or how you wanted to express yourself in the world? Do you have any, even if they're just sort of fun and fanciful memories from childhood? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think I was very captured by television,
Hmm.
shockingly, being a kid who grew up in 63 and then my dad being on it.
Right.
But I think the first sense of like, oh, that, like there's something like about that, was certainly seeing people like Carol Burnett and Lily Tomlin. I mean, a lot of my first kind of things that I created were, doing Carol Burnett characters and Lily Tomlin characters for my parents. And um, and and I think part, and I think that is the kind of the most concrete memory I had of that. uh and it's funny you said my memory is so good. I mean, I blacked out a huge majority of my childhood. I don't
Hmm.
remember probably 90% of it, and I had to kind of build my understanding of my life, based on some of my mom and dad's stories and stuff. But it was a lot of chaos in our house too, and I think a lot of the time was I didn't feel, um I felt like I was always kind of treading water in some ways. I loved school, and school was kind of my big achievement zone and where I kind of got all my self-esteem and a definition of myself. I was considered a smart kid. Um, and so that felt really, really good. But I didn't really know, except for I love to dance. I love to sing. I talk about this in the book a little bit, going to see that show Curly McDimple at the Plaza Hotel and really seeing her on stage, and like someone my age on stage
Hmm.
and being like, and going every night then to that show and being obsessed with it. Something of something about that. And I don't know if it was truly that I wanted to do that. And I kind of wish I could have a second life just so I could be a musical theater person.
Hmm.
Parallel life. Can you do that after 60? Maybe I can. But
Maybe you're already doing it
I,
elsewhere in a parallel existence. You don't know.
I may, this is so true. This is absolutely true. According to the physicists, we are. But there is that thing about, but I think also part of it was, and it's something that I am writing into right now, to talk about the last 15 years when I did finally get up on a stage and do my stuff, was I think I just wanted to be on that stage because that's where my dad was. And that's where all of his focus was. And it seemed like that's where all the important stuff happened. People paid attention to that space, whether it was TV or stage. And definitely I was born with that thing where it was like, hey, look at me, look at me. Aren't I special and wonderful? And I think that is, part of what people who are performers are born with. So I think that might have been part of my nature and part of my nurture, actually,
Right.
thinking about it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. You tell the story in the book about being backstage at your dad's Carnegie Hall performance. How old were you then?
That would have been 72. So it would have been 9,
Okay.
8 or 9. Yeah. Depending on which part of the year it was.
Yeah. And the way you described the sort of intoxication of that, like all of this
Yeah.
adoration, and you understood that it was for your dad, but you were so close to it. It was just like,
It was
intoxicating.
a very numinous experience. I was having an encounter with the numinous, and that when you open up, that's what live theater does. It opens up that field between the audience and the performer. There is electricity in the air. There is magic. People talk about it that way all the time, especially live theater. If you go to concerts, it feels like church. So there's this collective, archetypal, powerful, metaphorical field we open up in that space, which Jung talked about as the numinous, and we don't understand what that is. But it is enchanting, extremely enchanting, and yeah, it captured me, and it made me feel like, I think it really was like that experience of, and I think I really wanted the audience to understand what it is that sweeps a person into a sense of then seeing that person on stage as a god, because it taps into that part of us that is kind of in relationship with the sacred. And that feeling is a sense of the sacred. It's a sense of awe. It really is. It's a powerful sense of awe.
Yeah. So what was it like for you to watch, be right there when all of that electricity was in the air and, your dad was getting all of this, adoration really. But he was also your dad. You knew this guy pretty well. You knew this guy better than anyone sitting in the audience. Was there a disconnect there, or how do you think you took that in?
I don't know. I mean, as a kid, you're just kind of in it. I mean, it's just, and when you grow up in this stuff, you're just in it. You don't really think about what other people's parents do or anything like that. It's always in a tremendous amount of pride, a tremendous amount of excitement to know that I'm near him and part of that. I talk about that in the book too. That's part of that intoxication, that word you used. There is a sense of getting high off of something that might not be yours or is real, but is it real? But as a kid, you make everything pretty concrete. And so there's this sense that, it's, you do it, and it just adds to your sense of specialness. Like, oh, I'm with the special guy. I'm with the guy that they're chanting his name about. So it does inflate parts of you, of yourself, while at the same time, of course, completely diminishing parts of yourself too, because you aren't that person. And you don't know how to get there. And I was taught always to be very humble and very respectful, and to never take any of that too seriously. In some ways, my dad was very much a working class man of the people. And yet we lived this very privileged life. So I got 10,000 mixed messages about all of this
Right.
the whole time. And I think that's part of what I really tried to express in my book, is that this was a real mixed bag of messages that I had to sort through, and that really, and that's part of what I'm wanting to write into now. I really had to sort through all of that the last 15 years too. And, and have come to a new place with it now. But it's very, very, very intoxicating.
Do you think that you did not feel free or safe enough to tell your own story while your parents were still alive?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, it never even occurred to me when my mother was alive. And then when my mother died, that's when I kind of got that. I was 34 when she died. I got that, oh, people die. Oh my God, the biggest thing I've ever feared in my entire life, my mother dying, has happened. And this, shit or get off the pot kind of feeling as an artist. And I was very much enamored with solo show, personal essay people, Spalding Gray being one of my biggest heroes. And I thought I could tell my story when my parents were alive. I did try once in 99, made my dad very uncomfortable because he had not worked through his own relationship and his own self-forgiveness around the crazy 60s and 70s and all the drugs and alcohol and all of that. And I wrote that first show very much so with an eye of like, I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be blaming anybody, but I do want to talk about my life and why, my first show was called Driven to Distraction. And it was really about kind of like 4 or 5 main things that really distracted me from knowing who I was or my true self. I mean, I'd already started this conversation, because I felt like, why am I 30 something and I don't know who I am? Like, what's wrong with me? Where's the manual? I was always in search of the manual. I did a little short film called The Manual for Comedy Den about it. And so then when my dad was uncomfortable with it and I was so still enmeshed and so codependent with him, and he was, the most important person in my life, in my psyche for sure. At the time, my husband, Bob, most important person in my life, but my dad, was the center of my psyche. Definitely father-daughter complex stuff going on. And that's how I ended up going to grad school and getting to kind of work my narrative in a different form, in a different way, and learn, well, let's figure out how I did get here. Let's go study psychology, and they make you do that when you're going to become a counselor. Like, hey, you better know your own shit if you're going to be sitting with other people with their own shit, so you can self-manage. But immediately after I graduated, I was like, I have to tell more stories. And so I just did it really quietly around town. And then knew though that I had to wait until he was gone to really be able to fully step into that. It was interesting after he died, his manager, who'd been around with him for almost 30 years, I think by the time my dad died, said to me, Kelly, there was only room for one Carlin on the stage when your dad was alive. And I always thought that I was crazy for kind of feeling that. My dad never said that, but I could tell, like, as long as my art form was over here, he was okay. Because at one point he said to me, you don't want to be when I was doing all these story things around town, you don't want to be a stand-up comedian, do you? And I don't think he meant it to, like, I don't know. I think unconsciously part of him was like, well, he was worried. He's like, I don't want people heckling you and I don't want you to have to kind of jump through that hoop. And I was like, I have no desire to be a stand-up comedian, not my jam. But there was this vibe of that. Like, there's only really room for one Carlin on a stage. We could be writers, we could be actors, we could be behind the scenes. We could even be doing stories around town. But it's kind of funny to know that after my dad died during that first year, my cousin started doing open mics. My uncle started performing back east, doing stories on stage and hosting and emceeing stuff in Woodstock, and stuff like that. Like, we kind of felt like, oh, the big sun is gone and we're out of the shadow and we can crawl onto the stage a little bit. So I don't think there's any accident in that our psyches probably all unconsciously made a tacit agreement with him about that.
Yeah, so interesting how unspoken that was, until, I think, from reading your book, he asked to see your therapist with you, have an appointment with you and your therapist to talk about that.
Yeah, that
And
original solo show I wrote. Yeah.
right, because he said that he said to you he felt betrayed by you doing that. And oh, you know, I think what makes your book so relatable is the, you know, we've all had parents. We've all, some of us are parents, you know, like most of us know what it's like to be a parent and or a child. And the unbelievable yearning for approval, for parental approval, it's so deep in our wiring, even as a fully grown adult. It still
Yes.
surprises me to this day. And I think
Yes.
my parents are still both with the living, among the living. But I suspect that even when they're gone, you know, their presence will still loom very, very large in my psyche. I think that that's the reality that for, you know, many people, most people, is the people that raised us. And for people who were adopted, they have this wondering about their own. So
Yeah.
even if it wasn't the parent that raised you, like it's so deep. It's so deep.
Well, yeah. I mean, they are, first of all, they are our lifeboat at the beginning of time, right? And we've got to get on their lifeboat, and we've got to, on some primal level, this person's going to keep me alive,
Sure.
so I got to be all in with them. And yeah, and I'm an only child, and I mean all that stuff. And yeah, it was a really tough conversation to have with him. And I think he felt, he was from a different generation too. I mean, like looking back on it, when I was able to really write the book and think about it a lot, about why was that so hard for him. I grew up in the Oprah generation, Phil Donahue and Oprah. People are fucking saying their shit all over TV. Jerry Springer. I mean,
Mm.
all this stuff, right? And he came from a very, very different generation. um and he he wasn't a perfect human also. I mean, maybe he didn't get it right, or maybe that wasn't maybe the right thing to do. I don't know. I think he had his own demons to deal with still, and he was probably still working through it. But the other half of that conversation was, I see you as an artist, and I would never ask you to change a single word of this. Like, I'm not asking you to change your art or not do it. I'm just saying I can't stand by your side and walk through this. And you look at his own art, and he never revealed any of his pain, any of his inner doubts. He was the most confident
Hmm.
know-it-all on stage ever. People thought they knew George Carlin. They thought that he was revealing his most personal, deepest things. He never talked about. He wasn't Richard Pryor.
Hmm.
My dad never talked. I mean, he talked about his heart attacks once, joking about it with
In
Richard
relation to
Pryor.
Richard Pryor, yeah.
He talked a lot about drugs, but he never talked about his own demons with that. He never made himself the butt of a joke on stage that way. He made us, humanity, the butt of the joke, which is why I think people thought that he was being personal and real. But, I remember when I went to him also years later, when I thought, okay, I'm going to write a spiritual autobiography, like Eat, Pray, Love, like my search for the big questions, right? To solve the big mystery of my life, and kind of come at my life from that way. So it's not about my dad and drugs and alcohol. And I can talk about that in a way that's, about my spiritual longing. And
But how do you
he said
separate
that,
them?
well, I knew ultimately I wouldn't,
Yeah.
but at least I felt like it was a kind of a safer kind of a route to do. And it would just really be, it wouldn't be so much about my childhood, but would be, I could pull from it a little bit, but it would really be like maybe starting in my teenage years or something like that. And, even then he said to me, didn't you already do that with your first solo show? And I'm like, Dad, I had like two performances. Like I had I had a 5-week run that I was going to do with that original solo show that I put on the shelf, and he was like, real artists, they do their autobiographical work at the beginning, but then they move on. And, I think I was kind of dumbfounded in his presence at that moment, and just like, again, like, really, this is happening again. And then of course a day later, I'm at home, like standing, I have the memory of like standing actually right here where we're talking.
Hmm.
And it was like going, wait a minute, I never got past his autobiographical stuff. Like, what fuck is my dad talking about?
Who didn't
Like,
your sound was out just for who were you talking about that didn't talk about their autobiographical stuff
oh, I
or
said
that did?
Richard
Oh,
Pryor
right.
never got over his
He,
autobiographical stuff. I
and of course,
mean,
you didn't think to say that in the moment because we never do,
no,
right?
no, never. I could never come up with that stuff in front of my dad. But it was just like just such an interesting uh, shutting down of it, and still my dad uncomfortable with it. So that was his. But I've seen and looked at it now, and I really do understand that that was his cross to bear, and not mine. And I feel very clean
Hmm.
with the story I told, and I feel slightly vindicated too in the fact that Judd Apatow and Michael Bonfiglio interviewed me twice for the documentary. I had nothing to do with the editorial part of the documentary. We gave them everything and let them go off
Hmm.
and do it. And I watched the rough cut, and it was like, fuck, I'm in this thing. Holy shit. I told my husband, like, oh, fuck.
You didn't expect to be?
I mean, I knew they'd interviewed me twice, but
Right.
I didn't understand how much really my memoir helped tell the story of
Huh.
that first half of the documentary.
Hmm.
And I know that, and that how much they leaned into my mom's story, which I felt was so important to tell. And, does just get such short shrift in everyone's mind in all
Hmm.
these biopics and all these things. Rarely does the spouse get the due that is, that is owed them. And I really felt vindicated by that. Like, this made this a very different documentary because they were willing to go into the pain of the Carlin and the love and the healing, which ultimately is what my book is about. That
Hmm.
love gets you through it, that if you really love each other enough, you will rise above it and you will find your way through it all. And so, my bones, even in 99, I knew that it was going to be, you know, a gift to the world in the end, not like I'm some sort of like great gift giver,
Yeah,
but
no.
that it would be a positive thing towards the universe. It would add to the love in the world, ultimately. And I'm really glad that, even though it took a long time, that I feel like, yes, Kelly, trust your bones,
Hmm.
trust your gut with this stuff, um, I wanted to say to my dad, you raised me right. Of course, I'm not going to undo who you are or the gifts you gave to the world or the man that you are. I just want the world to see your full heart and your full soul. And I think that really happened in the documentary. And that's the feedback we've been getting. And we won a goddamn Emmy for it. It's like people recognize that it had heart and it
Hmm.
had edge. And that's my dad. He had a heart
Hmm.
and edge. And that's what he gave me. He taught me to have those two things and to bring those to the world in service of, you know, making humans feel like we're not alone, because we do. We all feel like we're alone so much.
Yeah, and your love for both of your parents really shines through. And I think the fact that you are so real about you know, their humanness, their beautiful qualities and their imperfections that we all have. And that's what makes it meaningful. And that's what makes the love that much deeper is, you're not loving them unconditionally, or you're not loving like, you're loving them as human beings, as complex, multifaceted humans. And I love, you probably didn't think much of this. Maybe you did, I don't know, but the subtitle of your book, Growing Up with George, it really struck me actually in that if you emphasize the growing up part, the growing up with George, it's like your story of individuation, right?
Yep, that's why I did
Um,
it.
but then if you put the emphasis on the with, growing up with George, because he's growing up too, damn it,
Yes,
during this
it was.
story, and
It's
you
a
act.
it's a parallel story.
Yeah,
Yes.
and you are each contributing to each other's evolution as a person when you tell this story. And then, of course, the last, if you emphasize the growing up with George, with this George guy, not
Yeah.
growing up with dad, growing up with George, because you're seeing him, as this, like, again, like multifaceted person who has these unbelievable, like admirable qualities that you just, have so much love for and appreciation for. And also, these imperfections that we all, when we have to knock our parents down from like God to human, and I think it
Yes.
happens to everyone at some point. It has to, that
Yeah,
can be really painful.
it is.
Um,
It's very hard, that
and it's
process.
Yeah, it's what makes the book, I think, again, so relatable outside of, you don't have to be, you don't have to have a celebrity in your family to relate to there's the real human, the complex emotions and the relationships, and some of the most moving parts of your book really deal with, your relationship with your mom. The chapter about your mother's death is really it's devastating. And it's also so heartful and heartfelt and moving. And again, these are universal themes that but you're telling it through your filter and your experience, and because you're so specific about it, it's what makes it, I think, so impactful for the reader, and so relatable. And to your point about feeling alone, it's like, I think that one of the biggest gifts of your book and of your show is the fact that it is so relatable, and you're saying all these things that most people might not maybe have the courage to say about their own families. But it's like, oh, I'm not the only one. And you might understand that intellectually, but to hear someone, so just again, it doesn't strike the reader, it doesn't strike me as any kind of vendetta. You're just sharing your own real experiences and your real journey with these very real people that happen to be your parents.
Yeah, I think it's, this is why 12-step programs work so well, because we sit inside these rooms and everyone shares their stuff. And the first thing we realize is, oh my God, that person's telling my story. And they probably have such a different background from you, or whatever. We think we're such odd little beings as humans, right? We want to be these special, unique acorns, like we talked about at the beginning. And yet in the end, and this is why there are archetypes and mythological themes, right? I mean, this is because in the end, we're kind of all living the same stories
Hmm.
in multiple different ways with different costumes on, but the patterns, they're not that many patterns. And this individuation process is very much about this finding ourselves and having to pull our parents off of a pedestal, or if you never put them on a pedestal and they were horribly abusive to you and insane, and it was too much chaos and not a lot of love, to find a way to see the wounds within them and forgive them on some level. And we have to do both, because I think either way, we either put them on a pedestal, or we put them and demonize them, right? And there's this duality we do with them, and realizing that we do that with ourselves too. Because if we can't do it with our parents, if we can't forgive them, and we can't see them as human, then we'll never be able to forgive ourselves and see ourselves as human. And I think that's the only way we can get through life,
Hmm.
is to really take ourselves, both to see that we're not the biggest pieces of shit in the world, and we're not fucking God's gift to the universe also at the same time. And that's why I think I used humor so much, and why I do use humor. And I was just teaching a memoir workshop this weekend about this, that humor gives you a chance to, if you can laugh at yourself, you're going to be okay. When you're able to laugh at the most stupid shit you've ever done in your life, and I'm not talking about laughing at being a victim to some really horrific situation or person, but as adults, no matter what, we're constantly making choices. And that's why in the book, even though, like that first marriage with Andrew is insane, the shit I fucking signed up for. But in the end, you know, uh, and I felt victimized for a long time when I left that. It took me a long time
Hmm.
to get through that, feeling like I had really, you know, sacrificed 10 years of my life and been really conned by this guy and all this kind of stuff. But when I was able to get to the point of like, oh, some part of me made that choice. some part of me said yes to him, even though it felt like it was not a choice in the moment. When I was able to see that part of me that made that choice and see the wound that led me there, and to forgive that
Hmm.
darling 18-year-old who so desperately wanted to be seen and heard and loved by, a man who just decided to put her on the pedestal, and all the Kool-Aid I drank from that. When I was able to see that and really go, oh, darling, 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 what? Um, then I felt like, then I could be free of it, in some way. And when you're free of it, then I feel you can really share those stories, because then they really will have universal appeal. If you're only going to play the victim and only going to
Hmm.
play the, look how I was conned, and look at the I call it the victim rescue perpetrator drama triangle, right? If we tell our story in that triangle only, the audience can't enter into it as
Hmm.
much. And either can our higher selves, either can we can't enter into our own story. We're stuck in the story constantly. But when we can really step outside of that triangle and see the little, the kind of the myth we're stuck in some ways, I think then we really can be free of it, um and really do feel whole again in some ways, or whole for the first time.
Wow, there's so much in what you just shared, and there's the element of having compassion for yourself and for those who hurt you or may have hurt you, um, intentionally or completely not intentionally. I mean, you talk about your dad didn't have anyone. He didn't have the role model of what he didn't know how to be a dad, right? He didn't have
Yeah.
a model for that. So, or the model that he did was, you know, uh,
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
when you can see your parent as a person who had their own wounds, and when you can reach a point where you can start to have compassion for them and not just feel like a victim yourself, that's huge. And then there's the reparenting of your wounded child and being able to give that part of you what it needs if it couldn't get it from, let's say, your actual parents. These are huge things on the journey. These are, like, I think, huge steps to coming into our own and really being the person that we do want to be. There's a quote I love from Eckhart Tolle. It's from his book A New Earth. And again, the power of books. I read that book, I couldn't even tell you how many years ago, but like I never forgot this line where he
I
said,
love that book too. Yeah.
where he says, anytime you feel superior or inferior to another person, that's your ego. That's your false self. That's not, and the thing that is so, counterintuitive in that to a lot of people, and probably myself when I first read it, is like, when you think of someone having an ego, you think, oh, they think they're the best, they have the superiority complex. But it goes the other way too. If you feel this like deep inferiority to others and this unworthiness and this, like, you're a piece of shit, like, that's not real. That's not you either. Like, that
It's
also is
right.
that's an artifice that,
Yeah.
that you're putting on, or that
It's it's a
you're identifying with.
reaction. Yeah, it's a reaction to the story of what you've been living, right? There's a one up and there's a one down always. There's always a power struggle. Anything that has to do with power or hierarchy is going to be ego for sure. And the a lot of the work I had to do on myself and still do, and the work that I do with clients, so much of it is helping people reclaim their treasure and their gift and their luminousness and their genius, and their power, and their, all of that stuff, that we put all of that in the basement in order to take care of our parents too. I mean, like, I know for me, when my mom was alive, there was some part of me that never did want to shine. And I looked back on my 20s and I thought, maybe part of my inability to kind of really step fully and own my own artistic voice was I didn't want my mother to feel completely left behind, because there's now two shining artists in the household. And what is she left with? So it was part of my caretaking that I did on some unconscious level. And I know that consciously, God, she would never have wanted me to do that.
Mm.
She always was my biggest champion. And, but there was this part of her that did feel betrayed and left behind, that I witnessed through her alcoholism. That was a big theme in their marriage, was her feeling put aside. And so I think I was really trained into that and thought, yeah, I better not put mommy aside too.
Well, and a big part of your story as being this like parentified child of having to take care of your mom from a ridiculously early age. I mean, so it makes sense that you would have felt that way. I want to
Yeah.
read an excerpt from your book that really stood out to me, and especially, I think is relevant to what we're talking about and the theme of this show. So this is you've this is shortly after you've married Bob, your second husband, and you guys have been together for how long has it been at this point?
And we've actually we've been together 31 years this
Awesome.
year. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, a lot of people who have been in, let's say, harmful, abusive, toxic relationships. I think your story is also like a beacon of light to show that it's possible to have been through that and to find something real and something healthy and something good. And also that you don't have to have fixed everything and resolved everything to get that. It's
Yeah.
not like, I think a lot of people feel unworthy, or they feel like they have to, be like superhuman in order to be worthy of, a loving, healthy partnership. And so I think your story also serves that. It also offers that gift potentially to readers as well, because that first marriage, and you go into it in great detail, and why, it's wow. I'll just leave it at that. But let
Yeah.
me read if let me at least read your words back to you
Okay.
and see what you make of them now. So this is again in the context of you've just married Bob and you're in your early 30s, and you're still trying to find your way in the world. And like society has all of these messages about how we're supposed to, like, milestones we're supposed to hit, and like and it ends up making, I think, many people, maybe even everyone, feel like they're getting it wrong. So anyway, this is the passage. You say, the foundation of that enormous chip on my shoulder was my trifecta of anxiety around my career: fear of making the wrong choice, fear of failure, and fear of success. What made up most of the fear of making the wrong choice was decades of listening to my dad tell stories of how miserable he'd been in the late 60s because of not honoring his quote unquote true self. I was scared of making that same mistake. At 33, I didn't feel like I had the time to waste working for 10 years only to end up hating my life and having to reinvent myself like he did. He was 30. By the way, we all do this, comparing ourselves to other people, whether it's our parents or our heroes at where they were at a certain age. He was 33 when he did the reinventing. Did I want to be 43 when I had to do it? No, better to follow the right path from the beginning. What I'd failed to realize with that inner logic was that to understand what it is you really want, you must first choose a path. It rarely works the other way around. You need to live a little so you can know what's working or not. Then, if need be, you can change course. My dad had chosen his path early, the big Danny Kaye plan, and had given it his all. But it was only through being on that path that he discovered who he truly was, a rebel who needed to speak the truth. I'd only heard the part of my dad's story where he was unhappy. He never mentioned the part about the importance of the thousands of hours of stage time he got that allowed him to discover his true self. Which brings me to my second fear, fear of failure. In order for me to find my true self, I needed to be willing to fail, take a wrong turn, fall on my face, and learn from it. But I believed that everything I would do in the world would be a failure no matter what. If it wasn't immediately excellent or approved of, or if thousands of people weren't chanting my name like they did for my dad, it was pointless. Ouch. I was paralyzed, unable to try things that were creative and risky. Dad's shadow loomed large. Add to all that the ever twisted logic of my version of fear of success. This is what you were just talking about. If I do well, then my mom will feel left behind, and then she'll get depressed and drink. And well, you have one hell of a drug to induce paralysis and ennui. And so I dabbled.
Yep.
So interesting. Why do you think you felt whatever you did that you would have failed no matter what? Was it that because you had this, like you were comparing yourself in this impossible way to your dad's success, or
Yeah,
was it something?
perfectionism is a bitch. I mean, it's just my version of perfectionism. And and you know, the chip on my shoulder, part of the chip on my shoulder was I didn't want to I didn't want to slog through the hard part. I didn't know how to. I'd always been really good at everything I ever did at school, riding horses, um, you know, like things like that. Photography, I was, you know, like I had a good eye, like went for it. But I never like went to pottery class and let myself fumble, or I never went into theater class because I knew I was going to fumble, you know, like anything that I didn't
Mm,
feel like I was going to be good at right away. Even if I had a curiosity about it, I didn't know how to just play into it. I didn't, not, that was never, I don't know if it was never modeled for me. My mother was willing to do that, I think, but she was so not my model for, you know, that thing in the world. My mother would jump into anything and she would say, fake it till you make it. And, you know, she became a producer and, you know, she was just a very organized, good people person skill, which can give you a job anywhere and do, you know, anything. And she was very bright, very smart, valedictorian and all that kind of stuff.
mm,
But I never, you know, and she tried to instill that stuff into me. But my God, here's this man, you know, taking up all the air in the room around this topic, you know, and so it was just it was an enormous amount of pressure. And I think also, you know, and it's something I've just kind of realized recently too, is my dad never let me in on his creative process.
mm,
He, you know, he was a writer and he went into the room by himself and he didn't practice in the around the house, right? He practiced on stage like comedians do. He never let me in on his vulnerability around, like I said about that, you know, like his learning curve around things. He didn't tell me war stories of, you know, of what it was like to get back up again. Like he never, I was, you know, I didn't get that kind of support. I think there's other artists and
mm.
who work with their kids differently. And I've met some of them, you know, where their kids are kind of brought into that world a little differently and their parent doesn't have whatever kind of own chip on their shoulder around that stuff. You know, I think this is part of my dad's inability, you know, his own pathology of his inability to be vulnerable. You know, I mean, this is why he wasn't vulnerable on stage. You know, my father was a perfectionist on stage,
Mm.
you know, and during the drug years, he wasn't. He was a lot looser and he was, you know, smoking a lot of weed and drinking and, you know, he could be a little looser on stage, but you know, the last 30 years of his career, he was
Yeah.
perfection, you know, and so I didn't see that it wasn't explained to me by anybody. If someone had just explained it to
Mm.
me,
It would
you
have
know, like
saved you so much suffering, right?
this is what rehearsal is for. It's for discovery, right? Like no, I felt like if I was, you know, when I started to act in my early 20s, it was like if I didn't understand it right away and didn't get it right away, then I felt like it was a failure. I didn't know there was like this whole, you know, and I didn't even know, I was so out of my body that, you know, being an
Mm.
actor was, it was all an intellectual pursuit. And I saw my dad struggle a lot with that too. But yeah, you know, the whole idea of failing was just such a new concept for me, and one that I really didn't really start to embrace until my 40s, I think, when I could really look back on it and, you know, and kind of get in, you know, I think it was actually even around when I started getting trained as a life coach, like life coaching training in general and leadership training, really getting walked through by some really powerful mentors around the power of failing and the power of learning and the power of beginning again, and the power of asking for help. Like that was not allowed in our culture and inside of our house. I think that's why my mother almost died from alcoholism. God forbid we ask for help, and my dad, never asked for help, rarely, right? So
Although he did come to you on a couple of occasions, and you talk about those in the book where, he was, well, there was one time where he had admitted himself to a brief stint in rehab later in his life. And
yeah.
and he called you up on the phone. He said something like, Kelly, I need to talk to you. And you were like,
Oh,
uh-oh.
oh fuck. Oh fuck again. And I think
But
because,
he wanted your, like, he
well,
felt.
and he was living in a system for a month that these people were making him get in touch with his feelings. I mean, this is the man who fully admitted his whole life, I live from the neck up. Like he had no idea how to live in his body or how to really be in touch with these bigger, darker emotions that once you're in touch with them, you learn to move through them. I mean, it's so shocked that I studied depth psychology. It's like, someone in the family, and I've always been the moody emotion carrier of my family. And yes, he did reach out to me because they were chipping away at that little box around his heart. And he was showing me some vulnerability, and we were able to, after that, especially, and even before that, to, you know and I think my mother's death and the relationship of, the solo show thing that I tried at the beginning, we did try to talk to each other more. We realized that we hadn't been relating. We had just been playing these very kind of tight roles with each other, and I was afraid to be vulnerable in front of him because I never saw him be vulnerable. And so, yeah, I mean, I write about, I mean, like that was like,
Well, you're also afraid of losing
so
his love, right? I mean, being vulnerable in front of him. And again, universally relatable, and it's that coming
yeah.
back to that, like, still yearning for your parents' approval when you're already like, you're no longer dependent on them. You're taking
Yeah.
care of, yourself, but there's still, like, deep in there somewhere in your psyche, there's this fear of, saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, being, excommunicated, or like.
Yeah, and I think also for me, it's like, my dad, I was vulnerable, and as vulnerably emotional as I could be as a kid with my dad, because he was the only safe person in the house to do that with. And so he would take care of me. But I was a very moody child because of all that was going on, and the terror. I rarely said what I was really thinking. It took a lot for him to get it out of me.
Hmm.
And I think a part of me, into my 30s and into my 40s was like, I always felt a failure around that stuff. Like, ugh, I'm the emotional one in the family. Just get over the victimhood, get over the story, Kelly, get over the wounding and get on with your life. And I always felt like my dad could never really say that to me directly, but I know as a parent, I'm sure he felt it. I'm sure all parents are like, just fucking get on with it, kid. Live your fucking life and get over it. And for some reason, I couldn't. There was something I needed to process. And it turned out that I needed to process it through writing, actually. It's like a lot of my, between Pacifica and the writing, I processed a lot of this stuff finally, and was able to get through it and to the other side. And I really do love the preciousness of those last 2 years in relationship with my dad, because I did feel in his presence more like a whole person getting to be with him. And I feel so, ripped off that fucking heart failure took him away, because it was like,
Yeah.
we were just starting to groove with each other. Damn it.
Oh, man. So I had Daniel Mate on the show. His dad is Gabor Mate, who has done he's a medical doctor who has written a lot about trauma, and
Mm.
he's written about attention deficit disorder, and he's a very, well regarded and beloved figure in that world. But I heard Daniel on another podcast. The interviewer said to him, "Wow, It must not have been easy being Gabor Mate's kid. And his answer, I just adored his answer. He said, I don't think it's easy being anyone's kid. And, it's like, of
So
course, right?
true.
Yeah, like you get what you get from your parents, and you don't get what you don't get from your parents, and they do the best they can, and they're in it.
Yes.
They're human and inevitably limited in some regard. You may have you got some wonderful things and some other things that might have been like difficult. And I think that really is everyone. I mean, don't mean to diminish
Oh
again,
no.
like people who've been
100%.
through horrible, abusive, like I'm not talking
Yes.
about that. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
But interestingly, Daniel and his dad are do these workshops together about building relationships between adult children and their parents and seeing each
Oh,
other. And it's wonderful stuff to just, I'm sure you would
oh,
really appreciate it.
beautiful.
Um, there's so many other things I wanted to ask you, though. You mentioned about coming into your own through writing and discovering that was your way of processing all of this, all of your emotions and all of these conflicting messages you got growing up. And so I want to know, first of all, because I saw your show back in 2012, and that the book came out a few years after that. So I'm
Hmm.
curious to know what your writing process was like, how it took shape. I mean, this is an open-ended question, but like, when did you start working on this thing, and how did it change shape and form and eventually become a solo show and then eventually a memoir?
So in 99, I wrote a solo show. It had about 5 or 6 of these major stories in them, very different construction. It was just about me, and it was called Driven to Distraction. Then I put that away. I went to Pacifica. I got to write a lot about my life because every paper they asked you to apply the theory you were learning through your own stuff, your own family dynamics and your own stuff. So I got to unpack it in that way, in a very therapeutic setting. And Pacifica itself was an incredible remothering experience for me, because it is like the temenos, the mother womb there. And there were some amazing women who remothered me through their role modeling too. When I left there, then I had some of these stories that I'd already written for the solo show, and then was invited to start coming onto stages and to write some of these and so
To
I
read them?
to read them,
Yeah.
yes, to perform them and read them off the page though. And so I had a bunch of them, and I was, like I said, I was working on it, kind of a bigger outline of my whole life kind of story, or my spiritual biography, or my spiritual memoir, or whatever it was. Um, and then uh, and then my dad died, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And this is part of what I'm writing about right now and working on, is really telling this part of the story. But I felt very torn by it. I didn't want to be seen as taking advantage of my dad's death or his fame. Suddenly I was in the spotlight a lot. I was the only child. I did step into the spotlight to take care of my dad's legacy.
Hmm.
And on social media, it was the year 2008. My dad died. Facebook and Twitter came really into their own, or were invented, or whatever the fuck it was. Um, and we got
Changed the
smartphones,
course of our lives.
and we
Yeah.
got smartphones that year too. So it was like the whole world changed that time, right? And then I started talking to Paul Provenza about this solo show, and he said, I will walk through it with you, and I will be with you, and I would love to direct this if you would let me. Huge fan of my dad's. And I wanted to do something
Yeah.
where we could talk about my dad's career arc and his story. And as Paul and I worked it out and talked more and more about it, we saw that my dad's arc was similar to my arc, that there is this self-discovery experience that happens in both of our lives in different ways, and that we could really play with that on parallel
Hmm.
levels. And
Yeah, you
and so
interweave clips of your dad's performances in your show.
right. And you're right. So my dad's a character, right? And I knew also, people, what we used to say, my show was in 2 acts. We used to say people come for the George, but they stay for the Kelly. Because after the first half, they're like, oh, trust her. She's a trusted narrator. It's like people need to know this stuff, right?
Sure.
So people come with their curiosity, but they see right away, oh, this is really Kelly's story also. And I did that a bunch, got to do a run at the Falcon, which was amazing. That was in 2015. But before that, I got to go to New York and do a solo show festival, and I applied for it like everyone else, and they let me. I did three shows at the Cherry Lane Theater in their black box. Dream of mine to work in New York, to do my art in New York, my dad's town. Got to take the subway to the theater in the Village. I mean, come on, I was living my dream. And so I had this 90-minute show, which was a very specific thing, and I didn't even have the Falcon version of it. It was the black box versions of it, the version you saw basically. And this was November of 2013, and lo and behold, some editor from St. Martin's Press had heard me on a podcast and had said to his assistant, find out if this girl's got a book deal and what her story is. And lo and behold, this young assistant went to the theater, showed up, it was sold out, and Paul happened to be standing outside, and she said, I'm here from St. Martin's Press, and I'd love to see Kelly's show because we'd love to offer her a book deal, we're thinking. And Paul's like, you can have my ticket.
To our listeners, the moral of the story is the power of podcasts.
It's true.
Right?
Put your story out there. Tell your story to the world. And I'd had an agent who approached me who I didn't even know was in cahoots with St. Martin's Press at the time. Like, she called him to see if I had an edit. Like, all this stuff was going on. Before I left New York, I was on the air train to the airport. To JFK, when I got a call saying we've got an offer from St. Martin's Press for you, and so from there I knew that I was going to have to tell a much bigger story. My 90-minute show was very much skimming the surface of my life. I mean, my marriage to my first husband, I think, is 5 lines in the first show. My time at Pacifica.
So my memory wasn't so bad. It was true that the book goes way, way deeper.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. No, this is a 330 some odd page book.
Right.
This thing there. And I knew that I would get to tell my story, my whole story. And so I had probably, I had to do an outline for them and everything. And I probably had almost 2/3 of it chunked out from the solo show that I could go into much more in depth, because writing is a whole different thing. But then I had this other third that I had to come up with from scratch that I'd never written about before. And she was a great editor, and she taught me how to take what I had written already from the stage to write it for the page, which is a very different voice. And you've got to take the reader on a very different ride, a same emotional ride.
Yes.
But you have to be able to tell things, because I can't talk with my hands. I can't show pictures.
Video
and
clips.
The power of theater is a very different power than the power of the page. So she taught me how to do that, but I had 9 months to write it. 9 months.
Wow.
Which I very much saw as the metaphor that it was like, I'm going to birth this baby. And because I got a nice advance, I could just dedicate 9 months of my life to writing. And it was, but beyond Pacifica, it was the best 9 months of my life. If someone could pay me every year to just sit around writing my life story, I would love that. And I knew what I needed to write. Like, I knew what needed to be there. I knew exactly how I needed to tell it. I had just spent 6 years developing this other version of it.
So interesting.
So it was easy for me. I was living it. I was in it, and I was thrilled because the solo show was fun and all, and it was great. And I learned a ton about being a performer, and I learned a ton about being a human by learning to be a performer. I healed a lot in myself by learning how to be a performer, and it's the new stuff I want to write about. But I knew that my soul would finally get to be fully seen and heard, because I would get to really, really tell my story, even though it was called A Carlin's Home Companion, like the solo show, because I don't know. I was so happy when that title came to me after a nap. And yes, it's a picture with Kelly and George on it. I get it. It's marketing. It's St. Martin's Press. It's the book world. It's how it is. I know reality. I'm not an idiot. But my soul, the parts of my soul that still felt unseen and unheard in the solo show, I knew we're going to get to be seen and heard more in the book.
Hmm.
So very, very happy.
That is fantastic. Real quick, so Paul Provenza, just give us some context and explanation of who that was, because it sounds like he was pivotal in developing your show that eventually
Yeah.
became yeah.
So Paul Provenza, I started after my dad died. I started meeting comedians. I didn't know comedians before my dad died. I knew a couple, but
Huh.
I'm not part of the comedy world at all. And comedians just started coming into my life like the 12 hours after my dad died. They started calling my house, and
Yeah.
Gary Shandling and Lewis Black and Richard Belzer being three who really, really took me in to their family and to their heart, and became very, very close friends with Shandling, especially, and Lewis also. Met Paul, invited me to come to the taping of The Green Room, the first season of The Green Room, and I came the night that Rain Pryor was on the show.
Hmm.
I'd never met Rain before. We'd known each other as acquaintances, and I'd seen her from afar, and I'd always been very, very jealous of her own solo show
Huh.
called Fried Chicken and Latkes. And I was just jealous that she was having that life, and I didn't feel like I got to. Envious more, not jealous,
Yeah.
envious, but that unlived life part.
Hmm.
We met, bonded right away, became very, very close to Paul, became part of the family, ended up producing with him the second season of The Green Room. He brought me on as a producer. And I started doing the work with him, and I started telling him these stories. I collected all the ones that I already had. And he just would come over and we would do these 5-hour talking sessions. Part of them were therapy, part of them were dramaturge stuff, and crying and tears and laughter and all sorts of things. And my dad was his hero. And so for him, it was this incredible paying it forward for him. It was
Wow,
incredible. Yeah, it was
that
incredible.
is
This
so
is the stuff
interesting.
I want to write about. I haven't
Yeah.
told this part of the story yet. And he's a gifted actor. He's a trained actor. I think he went to Juilliard. I mean, like, he's like a gifted actor on top of being a very satirical stand-up comedian. And he's a true artist in that nature. And he has very, very high EQ, like I do. He's an actor. He was very much into his emotions. So he wanted to delve into the emotions of my story. He wanted to delve into all of these nooks and crannies of the shadow part, and what made it hard and what made it easy, and what was I afraid of, and what parts of my dad do you think was hidden, and what was hard for me.
Hmm.
And he gave me he gave me all the safety and permission to tell all the parts that I was terrified to tell to the world, and
Unbelievable.
especially terrified to tell to my fans and to my dad's peers. And Paul was both of those things. He was a peer of my dad, knew my dad, and was a huge fan.
And
And
was a father figure really in this regard, in a sense, in this role that he played in helping you birth this
yeah,
show, right? Like,
a true mentor, like a
hmm,
true definition of the mentor,
hmm.
of um, step into every single fear, Kelly, and I'll be on the other side when you get through it. True mentor in that way. So very, very powerful relationship, and forever indebted to this man. So
That kind of brings us full circle to the quote that I uh, opened this with from your book about, you said, something was calling us forth and interweaving exactly the right people, places, and things to form one amazing life together. It's always seemed so destined. And
yeah.
there is a certain karmic quality to what you're describing.
Oh my
Um,
God, Eric. The first 2 years after my dad died, this is why I want to write the story.
mm,
I mean, the synchronicities and the gifts. I mean, I used to say I'm being held by a net of love and light right now. It was insane what was happening.
mm.
Yeah. So more to be revealed.
I can't wait. I can't wait. I really recommend Kelly's book, A Carlin Home Companion, to anyone listening or watching this. It is it is as entertaining as it is edifying, and edifying as it is entertaining. So I really look forward to seeing what you come up with next. And on that note, at this, you mentioned yourself, you're turning 60 this year. Who is the person that you want to be or step into it at this stage of the game?
Patti Smith.
There you go.
She fucking owns. She doesn't give a shit, and she just lets her genius out in every form. Follow her on Substack if you don't, people. It's just a revelation. She's like in her bedroom, bed unmade, hair unkempt, reading us poems. I mean, it just does not matter. And then she's like, I mean, she's just, and I was never into her as a young woman.
Hmm.
But she is one of my spirit animals now. And she's aging with such ferocity. And why give a fuck anymore? It's like you've got to speak the truth to the world, and she does it with such heart. And she just lets herself express in any medium that feels right to her. And that's kind of what I've been playing into right now, just being in full expression. So yeah.
I love it. Kelly Carlin, thank you so, so much for this conversation. I look forward to reviewing it myself because there's so much in there. And I learned a lot. And I just want to also mention again the work of Gabor and Daniel Maté to you. Daniel, who I interviewed on this show, is himself a musical theater composer and lyricist. So
Wow. Oh,
your the parallel Kelly and he probably have collaborated on something at some point, or
well, I did write a Demeter Persephone musical for my thesis for
yeah,
Pacifica. So we're probably producing that in another parallel
probably
universe.
so. Well, I wish you all the best with everything that is coming. And again, it's been a total delight and joy and privilege to be able to connect with you. Um, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with next. And again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Eric. This was a real pleasure.
Awesome.